Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am finally coming to you with part 2 to my Q&A. And I have no excuses for this. Really, I just have really no excuses for this. So this will be everything that's a little bit miscellaneous and also bookish questions. So the book summoner asked me, it's a stupid question, but what's your favorite character from The Last Kingdom and why do you like them? So for me, my favorite character is probably still Alfred. I love Alfred the Great in The Last Kingdom, and I don't know that I would love Alfred the Great as much as a figure if I had never been exposed to him through The Last Kingdom, but since he's gone now, I also really love Uhtred. I just love Uhtred. Uhtred is just a really compelling main character, and I think it's an odd case because a lot of times I don't like who the show or the book is following mainly. I like everyone around them, so it's very refreshing to just love Uhtred so much. Jacob also asked me about TV. So one of your recent videos focused on the TV series Lost, and I was wondering who your favorite and least favorite characters were. So that's right, I did do a video on the 10th anniversary of Lost going off the air. My favorite character when the show was on was Desmond. I really loved Desmond, and I still do, but since the show has gone off, I've often found myself thinking about Sawyer. I think Sawyer was a really compelling character when the show was on. But since the show has gone off, I have really found myself thinking more about Sawyer than I ever thought that I would. And I also really loved Sun. I think Sun had an incredible arc. She was one of the most incredible characters on Lost, especially when you compare her first episode to her last episode on the show. I mean, it's just incredible, the growth and the change that she went through. For least favorite characters, I hated Locke. And I know that's controversial. I don't care. I hated Locke. I really loved Ben too. I would put Ben in my favorite character list, and Saeed. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot Saeed. I am so sorry, Saeed. I really loved almost everyone on Lost but Locke. I hated Locke, and I also hated Jack. Which I think is also a kind of controversial opinion. I know a lot of people love Locke and Jack and say they wouldn't have been as invested in the show if they hadn't have been there. Like, please. To me, you could have cut both of them. I recognize Locke had an important arc to the show. I recognize that, but I never liked him. Katie's Infinite TBR asked me, do you have any favorite historical landmarks, or is there one with special meaning? What historical landmarks, places do you want to visit, and what are your bucket list places to travel? So I did get a couple of travel questions, which are some of my favorite questions to answer and are really helping me because I have the travel bug right now. This is the time of year I like to go. And of course, due to the situation, I can't. My wings are clipped, so I'm kind of feeling depressed about things. But I've loved almost everywhere I have ever been. And so it's hard for me to pick a favorite. I would say probably one of the most moving historical landmarks I've ever seen is the Basilica di San Vitale in Ravenna in Italy. So that's a church that was built or started being built towards the end of the Western Roman Empire. And so it started being built in the 400s and the 500s. And what's really interesting about it is it's done in a Byzantine style, which is my absolute favorite. I love Byzantine mosaics. I want to be surrounded by them at all times. But what's really interesting about the church is that you can see how things were shifting from the ancient Roman or classical mindset into the more medieval mindset. So you have two portraits of Jesus on one side of the church. And one of them, he has, you know, a Caesar haircut, and he's beardless, and he looks very young. And to the modern eye, you wouldn't have known that it was meant to be Jesus. And right across from there, you have the very stereotypical long-haired, bearded Jesus, which was done at a later date than the beardless one. And so you can see just how, you know, people's minds were changing, especially regarding religion. This was a very fractious time in terms of the Christian religion, but I went to Ravenna to see this church because of Dante. When Dante was exiled from Florence, he moved around a lot, but he wound up really in Ravenna. And Ravenna is where he died, and Ravenna is where he worked quite a bit on the Divine Comedy. And so my professor, when I took my Dante course, he talked a lot about how Dante would go to this church every day. He went to this church almost every day. It was just kind of part of his routine, was to go to service there and to walk around and to walk kind of the upper floor of the church, which you can't access now, unfortunately. And I just walked through the gates. You have to go through the gates to get up to the church. You can see it from a long way off down a street, and you have to walk through kind of the gates to get into the church because they close it up at night. And I walked through the gates, and the trees were kind of over the path and you couldn't really see the top of it. And I thought to myself, I said, I'm walking where Dante walked. I said, Dante walked this path and he walked into this church, and he did it multiple times a week. I mean, and I walked into the church and I saw the mosaics, which were apparently very spellbinding to Dante, and part of the reason why he wanted to go to that church all the time. I've wanted to cry in almost every old church. I've only cried in a few. I've been choked up in almost every old church I've ever been in, but I literally cried. Tears fell down my face in that church. It was so beautiful, and also just to feel, sometimes you're in a place and you feel the weight of the past, and that's just, I really felt it there. That was a really emotional experience. That's one of my favorites. The Basilica di San Vitale still has a lot of personal significance to me. I never felt like that even when I was in Florence. And in Florence I was very emotional. When I went last year I was on a Dante high, but I didn't feel it the way that I felt it walking into that church. And sometimes just churches get me, and most historical places of significance to me personally, I would tell you, are churches. Probably Chartres Cathedral in France. Stunning. I spent a full day exploring that church, and that was one of the first times I went to service in a Gothic cathedral. It was amazing. I mean, it was just amazing because Chartres has been through a lot, but interestingly, there's always been a church on that spot, and so one of the churches was sacked by the Vikings, so somebody rolled up the river and sacked it when actually people were in church, as a matter of fact. But the church that's there now is from the early 1100s, and I just thought to myself, sitting in there, I said, you know what? I'm sitting here, I'm listening to a service in French, and there are people who have done that on this spot for centuries. I mean, there are people who have done it on this spot since the 1100s, but even going further back with earlier churches, Chartres is really, really special to me. And I would also tell you Winchester is very special to me. Winchester as a whole, the whole entire town is very special to me. That was just a really momentous day to me when I went to Winchester in England. And then last but not least, I would tell you York, York Minster, because York is a very, very interesting city, and I highly recommend everybody go there. York is potentially, after Winchester, my favorite place in the UK because it hits all of my marks. It was an ancient Roman town, so actually Constantine the Great was crowned Roman Emperor in York. It was, of course, also a Viking town. It was founded by Ira the Boneless, and so its Viking name is Jorvik. And then it was also, of course, the seat of the House of York, and Richard III went there many, many times. York is very special to me because of all of my interests. Everything aligns for me perfectly in York. But things that are on my bucket list, really number one on my list is Istanbul. I would definitely tell you that Istanbul is the top of my list. I would love to go there. I would love to see the Hagia Sophia, and I would also really love to go to Jerusalem. So I want to go to kind of the Eastern Mediterranean. I would love to see more of that side of things. And I would also really love to go to Wales. Wales is very high on my list. I've skirted close to Wales a couple of times, and I'm pretty shocked I've never gone into Wales. Novelle Novels, Emily from Novelle Novels asked me, my question is, what is the first book you ever fell in love with? That's really hard for me because I know a lot of people have very fond childhood memories and actually can remember things they read year to year, like, Books in Lala. She does her kind of childhood favorites, reading my childhood favorites every now and again, and she apparently can remember multiple books that she read when she was in a certain grade, and I really don't. I genuinely don't. I can't remember what was my first kind of book obsession. I think as a toddler, I really liked The Rainbow Fish. But as I get older, like thinking about something that was maybe my first memory of really loving a book, maybe nothing until Harry Potter. I mean, maybe Harry Potter was it. So I'm gonna go with Harry Potter. Let's just stay safe. Lev asked me, if you could only choose one book as your absolute favorite, which one would you pick? So I could go easy here. I could say Dante, Divine Comedy, but I will go with what is my truest answer, because let's call it like it is, Dante's poetry. Maybe you don't consider Dante a book, but the book I would read over and over and over again is still my favorite book of all time, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I know, judge me for it. I don't care. Come at me in the comments. I love Interview and I love Anne Rice, and I'll never be able to stop. Vonner Steller asked me, would you consider hosting a read-along? And I would. I kind of put this out a few weeks ago asking if I did a read-along, what would y'all want it to be of? So you can feel free to leave that for me down below. I've thought about doing a Dante read-along. I'm not gonna lie. I've thought about it. And I've thought about doing maybe some other kind of interesting classics like that, but I feel like to do a read-along, it needs to be something that I've already read so that I can technically lead it and have actual information for you guys. So do let me know down below whether or not that's something you would be interested in or what you would be interested in doing it on. Used for Misk, I hope I'm saying that right, asked, what is your most favorite book of all time, fiction and nonfiction? So fiction, it's still Interview. Interview with the Vampire is probably my favorite fiction book of all time. Nonfiction is kind of a recent read for me. It's something I've read in the past year, and it's Lives of the Artists by Giorgio Vasari. Y'all knew that was coming, didn't you? I love him, and I just love the Lives of the Artists so much. I highly encourage you to read it. Interview, I can understand when people say they don't like it, but Lives of the Artist is genuinely incredible, and I think everybody could see its merits. Brian from Bookish asked me, what is your favorite book, fiction or nonfiction, that you think would surprise us? And I wasn't quite sure how to interpret this question, Brian, because I kind of took it to mean something that would surprise y'all, a book that would surprise you during the reading experience. But I think now maybe you mean it would surprise you that it's actually a favorite for me. It doesn't seem like something that I would typically read, but I'm gonna go with that first option. This is a book that I do think will shock you as you read it, and it might also shock you that it's a favorite of mine. But I used to really be into music biographies, especially when I was in high school. I was really in deep into hair metal. We've discussed this before, I think, but I read quite a few music biographies and a lot of band bios or kind of behind the scenes with music. They're all a little bit shocking because they're all covering some really crazy stuff. So definitely, you know, when we're talking about music biographies, you have to talk about The Dirt, which is Motley Crue's biography. That's a shock all the way through, as is Walk This Way, which is Aerosmith's, which is my favorite music bio. But the book that I would tell you is probably the biggest shock to read is Girls Like Us by Sheila Weller. And so this book is actually a triple biography, so it's telling the story of Joni Mitchell, Carole King, and Carly Simon. And so I got this mainly for Carly Simon, who I love to this day, and I was genuinely shocked by her story in particular, but I think you are shocked by everyone's story. You were shocked to see just what went into their music, and specifically with Carole King, you know, she just did so much. And the Carly Simon side of things was really dramatic, and I still to this day hate James Taylor. I will hate James Taylor forever because of this book. I already didn't like his music, so that really didn't turn me off of his music, but learning about what he did to her, it burns me up. I'm getting a little bit mad right now. I hate James Taylor. I'm sorry if you love him, but if you love him, maybe don't read this and hear his backstory with Carly Simon, because you might turn on him too. Arcadian Books says, maybe this is basic, but what's the best book and worst book you've read so far this year? Well, the best book I've read this year is Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. That's definitely my favorite book of the year. My least favorite is probably The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins, because I had such high expectations for it. I really thought it was going to go somewhere. It's not a bad book. In fact, I would suggest it to you. I think it's actually a decent read. I just had such high expectations for it that I was inevitably let down. Faith from Faith in Books asked me, what inspired you to study Latin and why did you abandon that as an academic pursuit? At least I've heard you mention you no longer study it formally. Do you still read or translate Latin sometimes? Do you find you've retained it? That's a fascinating question. So if you don't know, I studied Latin for the most part when I was in college, but I had studied Latin in high school. And so my background with Latin is a little bit convoluted in that I didn't study it until later in life. And I think for most people, when they decide to go with Latin, they do it very early on. But I actually did Spanish. I did Spanish from elementary school up until halfway through high school because I had a terrible Spanish 2 teacher in high school. So I decided to shift to what I thought would be an easy language. Since I already had that basis in Spanish, I switched to Latin. And so actually, yes, Latin in high school was very, very easy for me because I had all that knowledge of Spanish. And again, maybe if you don't know, Latin is dead. You know, it's a dead language. And so it's actually the foundation for the 5 Romance languages: French, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, and Italian. And so it gives you a good background in any of those if you want to move into a Romance language. And if you have studied a Romance language, you have a good background to go into Latin. The kicker for me was when I transitioned from high school to college, and I didn't start at Latin 101. I tested into Latin 2. That was the problem. I should have started at Latin 1. And so I was behind from the get-go, and so I really just struggled through Latin through all 4 years of undergrad. And so just really the way that they taught Latin from high school to college was entirely different. Basically, when I finished Latin 4, when I finished my final year of Latin when I was in university, I just gave it up because I was so glad to be done with it. And sadly, I have never really come back to it. In a weird way, yes, I have retained it because it's actually very, very useful when you are in a country that speaks a Romance language. So for instance, I never studied French, but I find French to be an easier to understand language. I can understand French pretty well, but I have very little to say back to you. And Italian is the same way. Italian is much easier for me to speak, I think, because of Latin, but it's harder for me to understand because what's changed from Latin when it morphed into Italian are kind of the pronunciation things. And with Spanish, I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I think I can speak Spanish okay, and I think I can understand some Spanish okay. But I'm really grateful to Latin because I do not think I would be in that position at all. Laura Croft asked me, what other hobbies do I have? And so one of my main hobbies is I do traveler's notebook pages. I will insert some photos here. I usually do this to basically document my travels, and I am way, way behind on things, but I used to do this quite a bit, and I did it a lot when I studied abroad. But this is one of my main hobbies. I haven't done it so much in a while. I should get back into it. Amanda Morton asked me, what are your favorite locations or places in North Carolina? Has your family been there a few generations? And so, yes, my family has been here a few generations. I have been doing some genealogy work basically while all this stuff has been happening, and I am really, really tickled with what I found regarding one side of my family. The other side I haven't really explored to the same degree. But on my mother's side, we have been in North Carolina since the late 1600s, which is really interesting. And before that, we were in Virginia. So kind of the joke in the family now is that we came with John Smith, because wouldn't that just be cool? It's just cool to think of that, because where we're from in Virginia is very close to the Jamestown area. And so I'm always like, oh, John Smith, That's my cousin. Not really, he's not. My favorite locations and places in North Carolina, I would definitely say Nags Head. Nags Head is towards the top of the state on the coast, and it's around the Kitty Hawk area, which is probably one of the most famous places in North Carolina. It's where the first airplane flight took off, the Wright brothers. That was at Kitty Hawk. That's in the Nags Head area. I think that's one of the most beautiful areas of the state. In terms of cities, I really like Winston-Salem. I just do. I really like Winston-Salem. I am not nearly as familiar with Charlotte as I probably should be, so I can't really recommend Charlotte, but Winston-Salem is a cool place, as is Boone. Boone is a really, really neat area. Blowing Rock, that's another beautiful area of the state. We're really lucky in North Carolina that we have the mountains and the ocean really close by. Starscream Live asked me, here's the question all of us North Carolinians get asked at some point. Do you prefer the mountains or the beach? And we do. We always get asked this, and I'm the beach, 100%. You could tell me you'll never see the mountains again. You can only pick one. You can only go to the beach or go to the mountains again. I'd pick the beach. I'm sorry. I don't get the fuss about the mountains. I think if you're like a hiker, that's probably what appeals to you a little bit more. But for me, the beach all the way. I really do. I belong near the sea. Joe Smith also asked me, I know you love to travel, so which places are top on your travel list that you were yet to visit and why? So like I said, Istanbul is just the top of my list. And the reason why for that is that I want to see the Hagia Sophia. And I also have kind of this goal in life, which is to see all of the places that were called a capital of the Roman Empire. So Rome was not the only capital of the Roman Empire, but Ravenna was, and so I've been to Ravenna. Milan was also a capital of the Roman Empire, and so I've been to Milan, so I've been to 3, really lucky. But Trier in Germany was also at one time a capital of the Roman Empire. But the most famous other capital than Rome was Constantinople in the east, which is now termed Istanbul. I just want to go there for, a wide variety of reasons. I want to go there to eat because I love Turkish food. And I want to go there to see, the Hagia Sophia and the remaining classical structures. I also really want to go to Egypt. Egypt is very high on my list just because as a child I was fascinated by it, and I still think it would just be some of the most amazing things to say you've seen. I just imagine it is amazing to see some of the things that are in Egypt. And the same can be said for me with Jerusalem. Like I said, kind of the Eastern Mediterranean I'm really, really attracted to. But I want to go to Jerusalem for a wide variety of reasons, religious reasons, historical reasons. I want to see the Crusader castles in that area. It just would be fascinating. I just think it would be genuinely fascinating to go there. Wales, I don't have any real kind of profound answer for, but that I just think it's going to be beautiful. I think it would be beautiful to go to Wales, and I feel the same way about Ireland. It's a shock to me that I have never made my way to Wales or Ireland, given how much I loved being in Scotland and England. You would think that I just would have tried to see that entire area, but I have yet to go to Ireland or Wales, and I just want to go because I know they will be stunning. Connor Stompanato asked me, what is your favorite part of making videos? And for me, that's the brainstorming process. I have a lot of fun brainstorming ideas, and there are a lot of ideas for videos that I have written down somewhere that will never see the light of day because I ran out of time, I didn't do them in the appropriate month, or I just decided they aren't a good video idea. But still, when I'm coming up with the ideas, I just have a lot of fun with that, even if they never come to fruition. Megan from Megan the Story Girl said, my question is, if you could become one character in a book, who would it be? Oh gosh, that's really, really hard. I feel like I would want to say like something that resembles a Hallmark movie. That's kind of who I would like to be, because I thought about maybe, somebody in Lord of the Rings. No, I don't really want to live in Middle Earth. I don't want to live in Middle Earth. And I don't want to live back in time at all, I am gonna go with some sort of contemporary romance. It feels like a cop-out to say that, but it would be fun to be in like a contemporary romance. Like, oh, we all are on a group trip to Iceland and our tour guide is really good looking and he takes, you know, a liking to me, and we go to the Viking museums and we see the Northern Lights and we have a connection, and then there's a miscommunication because he overheard me say something to somebody else and it made it seem like I didn't like him, and so he decided to kind of pull back, and then everything is resolved at the end and we're together and we live in Iceland. And yes, I am telling you the plot of a Hallmark movie because they're all made the same way, but they're all good. My guilty pleasure is a Hallmark movie. It really is. Laura Wichello, I'm sorry, said, since I heard you mention your love for English history and lit, do you have a favorite writer from the 18th century? And I am just now digging into the 18th century. I have never really explored the writers of that time, and I have been really intimidated by it for some odd reason. But I'm currently kind of reading through James Boswell's bio of Dr. Johnson, so I kind of would like to read Dr. Johnson, but I'm also currently reading Tom Jones by Henry Fielding for a read-along, hosted by Captain Wentworths on Instagram. I will link to her page down below. And I've also recently read a work by Daniel Defoe that I really liked, so I think I can like 18th century literature. And I think specifically I have high hopes for kind of that Gothic genre. I have a lot of high hopes for Anne Radcliffe and for The Monk by Matthew Lewis. I just really think I'm going to like that period. Over Here Reading says, my question is, what kind of note-taking, if any, do you do when you're reading books for just yourself? And that's really interesting because probably prior to BookTube, I stopped taking notes in books. Once I got out of college, I was just kind of relieved I didn't have to do that anymore. But now that I know the world of tabbing, and I know the world of underlining by using your bookmark, that's one of the most ingenious things I've ever heard. I think it was Tia from Tia and All the Books who told me that she uses her bookmark when she wants to underline instead of getting a ruler or making it sloppy. And that's the most ingenious thing ever. I kind of wish I could go back to school and tell myself, look at all the fun you could have. You could color code tabs. You could underline easily. But I did stop for a little while, but I take a lot of notes for myself in the margins of the books. I really want to be somebody who can take notes in a separate notebook to kind of always have on hand. And I would love to do like a quote notebook. And I've started doing that before, but like right now, reading the Romantic poets, I'm currently reading through a lot of John Keats. Well, I look up each poem that I've read. I write the year that it was done, when it was published, or if it was never published, and I write kind of, okay, this is when he broke out of writing in another writer's style because he started out kind of mimicking Edmund Spenser. So I'll write, okay, he broke out of this style here. And then I'll underline, of course, anything that's really beautiful, and I can go, wow, that's just stunning. Occasionally I do write wow in the margins. It has to be something pretty spectacular, but I will write wow beside that. And then if I notice references to other things, I like to underline those references and say, okay, they're referring to Paradise Lost. They are referring to Dante. That's really, really fun for me. That's the most fun part of note-taking for me, is when somebody makes a reference to something else that I've read. So that's kind of my note-taking scheme. It's very harried and crazy. And I do plan on doing a video on my annotation style fairly soon, before the end of the year anyway. So hopefully I can talk about that more in depth there. Matt R. asked me, what are your favorite reading genres besides history and classics based on my knowledge? And who are your favorite authors in fiction and nonfiction? If you want to split it up on genre, go ahead. Besides history and classics, I would definitely say that I read mostly fantasy. Fantasy and historical fiction and classics, they make up the bulk of my reading. My favorite nonfiction author is John Julius Norwich, because he had a lot of varied interests as a historian, and I love his historical nonfiction books. He has so many different historical nonfiction books on different periods, specifically within the medieval period, and so he has a lot on the Crusades. He has a book that's basically the entire history of Venice. He has a book on the history of France. He has books on the Tudor period. He was a really varied historian, and I found nearly everything that I read by him to be incredibly good. For fiction, my favorite fiction writer is probably Juliet Marillier. She is my favorite currently working fantasy author. Even when her stuff feels like a misstep compared to some of her other works, it's still better than some other writers on their best day. Her worst is still really, really good. Deborah McDonald asked me, do you have siblings and is your family bookish? Where did you get your love of reading? So no, I am an only child, and my mom is probably the only other bookish member of my family. She's the only other person besides me who really reads for fun, but we have entirely opposite tastes. She mostly reads mystery, thrillers. That's really what she's interested in. I did finally get her out of her comfort zone and reading a few fantasies so that we could talk about those, but for the most part, she reads totally opposite to me. But I definitely got my love of reading from her because that was just kind of an aspect of our evenings, and it still is. You know, sometimes we're just both sitting there together reading, and it's just a really, really nice experience, and I think growing up, that's what ingrained my love of reading. Katie Books asked me, what was the first and last physical album you bought? And that is a really interesting question because I have had to rack my brain here. So I have never really bought an album, like a true vinyl album. But if we're talking CDs, as in an album by an artist, not necessarily vinyl, the first album I ever bought, and I remember this, I do, it was Millennium by the Backstreet Boys. No judgment here. Yes, I was a Backstreet Boys fan. And no, NSYNC do not compare. They just don't. Thank you for that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. The last album I probably bought was, I'm guessing something maybe like a Greatest Hits. I'm feeling like I probably got a Bon Jovi or a Boston. Boston really sticks out to me. Maybe I got Boston's Greatest Hits as my last kind of physical album. And if not that, it was probably Lady Gaga's The Fame. And not the Fame Monster, not the album that included Bad Romance and Alejandro and Telephone and stuff like that. The Fame came basically a year before that, and that was the album with Just Dance and stuff, and so Bad Romance, Alejandro, they were added on for a second edition of the album that was called The Fame Monster. So I'm guessing my last physical album bought was probably The Fame, or it was probably Boston's Greatest Hits. And I don't know what that says about me, but I was a very varied music listener in high school. Katie from Books and Things asked, if you could recommend a book to a book character, what character would it be and what book? And I thought really long and hard about this, but I would recommend Wuthering Heights to Catherine Morland from Northanger Abbey, because wouldn't she just love it? Would she not be obsessed with it? I think she would be. I think Catherine Morland is in Wuthering Heights' target audience. I just think that she would have loved the drama of it all, and she would have loved dissecting the relationship between Heathcliff and Kathy and talking about whether or not it's a revenge story versus a romance. I just think Catherine Morland would really, really get on with that book. Christy from Dostoevsky in Space says, I'd love to know how you learned so much about ancient literature, as that is a topic that interests me as well. And basically, before I was a history major, I switched majors a lot. For a long time, I was a classics major. And even when I switched into history, I never really changed that focus on the classical world. And so I was exposed to a lot of ancient classics through school. I really just fell in love with ancient classics and have never looked back and have actually really never stopped reading them. So what I'm trying to do now is go back over things that I read in school and reread them now, especially in terms of ancient classics. And that's been really fun to me. That really has been very interesting to me. But if you are somebody who kind of wants a good place to begin with ancient classics. I think with ancient Greek classics, you still can't get better than the Odyssey. It is a very streamlined story, and you already know some of it. I guarantee you that you do. You already know some of it. It doesn't drop you in the deep end like the Iliad does. So I still think the Odyssey is the best place to start with ancient Greek classics. But I think the History of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius is probably the best place to start with Roman classics because it is so fun and gossipy. Either that, or if you want to go with poetry, Ovid's Metamorphoses is another great place to start. I really love Ovid's Metamorphoses. That's one of my favorites of all time. Well, thank you again for sending in your questions, and thank you once more for 1,000 subscribers. We have moved past that now, and I am really thrilled about it. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.